start. So please do stay on the line. So welcome everyone to the webinar. Thanks for joining. We still have people getting online and getting into the webinar. So we're just going to give it a couple more minutes, but thanks for joining us so far. So good afternoon, everyone, or good morning if you're joining us from the other side of the Atlantic, and welcome to this webinar, PSD2 and SCA, an opportunity to differentiate. My name is Alan Moss. I'm VP of Marketing with Mura Systems. We're a leading supplier of mobile acceptance solutions going back to 2008. Been very much part of the innovation in mobile POS and bringing mobility in store. And certainly what we're seeing right now is obviously in store is in an interesting place. I think you'll all agree on that. But certainly there's a lot of interest in card payments as a whole, certainly contactless and NFC payments. And generally what we're seeing with coronavirus is extending that secular growth trend towards cashless payments. I think you've probably seen some of the announcements on contactless limits being increased. The UK announced that beginning 1st of April. So you can now use contactless for up to £45, and other European countries are following as well. So very interesting to see how coronavirus or COVID-19 is already affecting card payments. This event, as you know, is organized by Merchant Payments Ecosystem. We had a fantastic event back in Berlin in February with over 1,200 industry movers and shakers present. And of course now, you know, it's 2 months later, but hard to consider how we could have a face-to-face event of that magnitude. But the good news is that we can get together on webinars. So today, I think we've hit a record. We've gone over 570 people registered for the webinar, which is fantastic. So thank you all very much for joining us today. There's a lot of questions which people have provided before the webinar, and we'll be trying to address those in our little Q&A session afterwards. Just in terms of introduction, I obviously mentioned mobile acceptance and in-store, and we're living in interesting times, just to put it cautiously in terms of the in-store environment. But in terms of online, it's a fantastic period of growth, as I think everyone knows. I saw some figures coming out from ACI worldwide earlier this week, which were looking at March and the online sales figures for March, which are about 74% up in terms of average transaction volumes versus the same time last year. To me, it's interesting to see that some segments are performing much better than others. Perhaps no surprise to see home products, DIY, garden essentials, all of them going over 90 to 100 to 160% growth. But even areas like electronics and jewelry notching up very respectable 25% plus growth rates. So clearly it's a great time to be in e-commerce. But at the same time, there are risks, new risks, growing risks. We've seen that there are specific phishing scams related to coronavirus. And we've also seen a growing level of fraud, so around 13% by transactional value compared with this time last year. So some of the great issues that we'll be talking through as we look at PSD2 and SCA. So at this point, it would be good to introduce our speaker and our sponsor, which is Ekata. Ekata has a great slogan, let's say, which is linking digital identity back to humanity. So to me, it's a fantastic way of looking at how identity verification provides and adds value to digital transactions by identifying people behind it. But without taking any more of his thunder, I'd like to introduce our speaker, who is Arjun Kakkar, VP of Strategy and Operations for Ekata. Arjun.
Hi, Alan. Thank you so much for the setup and introduction. Of course, these are challenging times, and several of the trends that you talked about is what Ekata is seeing in our data too, because we serve over 1,700 customers globally, a lot in e-commerce. And we can talk more about the details of that maybe in Q&A or after we go through the agenda here. What the big thing that we are noticing in the market is, like, of course, there is an upswing, but we got to be cautious about where it's going to land, because of course there might be there's almost surely a recession coming, and what impact that's going to have on the overall side. E-commerce is going to gain share, but it's going to be share of a smaller pie for a little while, at least in the midterm. Anyway, those are interesting times. I'm just introducing myself. I head strategy and operations in Ekata. I'm responsible for Ekata's payments business, including the products, revenue, and growth. I have been in Ekata for over 5.5 years in various functions. Next slide, please. All right, so let's get to the topic that everyone is here to talk about. First of all, it's about how merchants and payment providers can maximize acceptance. And to set the context here, as several of you would know, that in October 2019, the EBA set 31st December 2020 as the final deadline for PSD2 SCA. That was changed from the previous deadline. Because of COVID-19, they met again, and in late last month, I think it was March 25th, they reiterated that they will not be extending the end of year deadline, and they will continue to monitor the situation. The fact is that it is very likely going to get extended, but we can discuss that more if there are questions related to it. But that's just one of the contributors of uncertainty if you think about the strategy and tactics related to secure customer authentication, PSD2 SCA. In our discussions with merchants, acquirers, processors, and various payment providers and networks, we work with several of them. We have realized that there is a lot of variation in how people are thinking about the topic. There are lots of unique perspectives. So we thought that based on these conversations, we thought, wouldn't it be nice to synthesize these perspectives? We also recognize that we are seeing a part of the market, even though we see a large part of the market given our customer base and the conversations we have. But we wanted to have a more comprehensive view of the market, which is why we commissioned an interview campaign with Stratgranat, which is an amazing consultancy firm based out of Europe, and with consultants spread all over Europe. And they did an excellent job for us in getting us perspectives right from product managers to the C-suite level of 36 different acquirer processors and PSPs. We have merged these findings with our own and will discuss some of them with you today. If somebody is interested in more detailed findings, we can talk offline about it, but I just wanted to at least give you the summary of those findings and the biggest value takeaways. So if you're a merchant or a payment provider in the audience right now, our promise to you is that you will learn at least one or two things based on today's discussion that will help you make better decisions related to your company's SCA strategy. And I hope I can live up to that promise. Next slide, please. So I wanted to start with what is the intent of PSD2 SCA. On the left over here, I just pulled out a screenshot from the EBA's opinion on PSD2 SCA. And you see a line there. It says this makes consumers more confident while buying online, which essentially translates to enabling more trust. But is that happening? Like, if the intention of PSD2 SCA is to enable more consumer trust, is that really happening? Or will that happen when SCA comes into full force? Let's talk about that, and let's look at the drivers of consumer trust. Next slide, please. We know lots of people have talked about lack of consumer trust online. It's big in the discussions right now, as it deserves to be. The three drivers that we feel of trust or lack of trust are fraud, friction, and false declines. And if you actually look at it from the consumer standpoint, it becomes obvious why, right? If you imagine yourself as a consumer, you go and buy something and you find fraud on your credit card bill. What would you think about the online merchant or that card? And you would almost feel they are not doing their job well. That leads to lack of trust. Looking at the friction side, if you are making an online transaction and if you as a merchant end up thinking that, if you end up looking at the real experience and there are multiple steps and multiple hurdles, friction while buying, you end up feeling, why are you making me go through all of this friction? At least, of course, there's some friction is required for confidence, but a lot of friction has a negative impact on trust, is what we have found in our research. And finally, false declines. This might be the worst culprit. If you are, imagine again as a consumer, you're going and buying something online, and you end up getting to a situation wherein you are, of course, a legitimate customer, and your transaction is not authorized. The first thing that will come to your mind is, if you don't trust me, how can I trust you, right? Like, there's at least some impact on trust over there. You might move to some other merchant. So these are the three drivers we feel. Let's talk about each one of them. Next slide, please. So I wanted to start with this somewhat simplified graphic. The reason I've simplified it is because there are more complicated ways to express the interplay between fraud and friction. But it is good to have a visual, a mental map of the interplay between fraud and friction, because they are not disconnected. there is a trade-off curve. So if you look at this chart, if you look at the horizontal side, you see fraud, and you want to be to the right, that is lower fraud. So it goes from high to low fraud on the horizontal. If you look at the vertical, you see friction, and you want to be on the top, that is lower friction. There's a trade-off between the two, and which means that if you actually go way to the right at the bottom, you go to extremely low fraud, you are going to very high friction. And that leads to an impact on your lifetime revenue from the customer, because there is a loss of or a drop-off rate because of customers not finishing their transaction, and that's a lifetime revenue loss. If you go flip to the other side, to the other extreme, you go to extremely low friction, that is akin to open doors, right? If you have open doors, there's going to be a lot of fraud, a lot of chargeback. Now, what's interesting in both of these is both of these red points at the end, you will see that there is loss of trust on both sides. So what do companies do? They typically choose a North Star metric that has both fraud and friction, false declines, these things incorporated in, and you choose some happy medium in the middle. That's that bluish purplish dot in the middle. And that is the case where they balance between fraud and friction. I just wanted to introduce this figure because we can talk about the impact of PSD2 as we carry on this. Next slide, please. So before we start on coming to solutions, let's look at, does trust really matter in online transactions? I don't think anyone will doubt it. Ekata did a survey with over 7,000 consumers. This is different from the Strat-Granat survey we were talking about, or interview campaign that we were talking about earlier. 7,000 consumers, the 3,000 of them in North America, 4,000 of them spread across Europe. And we asked various questions related to trust, friction, etc. And I wanted to give you some of the thoughts from there. So 98% of those whom we surveyed, consumers, said, and these were online shoppers, said that trust really matters for online transactions. Of course, no surprise there. Next slide, please. Now, this part was interesting. When we asked them, what is the impact of fraud on their behavior? So if they see fraud while purchasing something online on an online platform, how will they think about it? You see towards the top, between 60 to 80% are very likely to trust you less. That is, they will do things like stop using the product, start using a competitor, or tell others. Now, tell others, and this is the negative of good word of mouth. This is negative word of mouth. This is like a downward spiral of people telling bad things about you. Now I drew this gray line in the middle and put complaint directly and post negative feedback separately, because it's, at least in these two cases, you know what's going wrong. This is when customers are providing you feedback that you will gain from, and you can try to fix things. Unfortunately, a lot of what happens in the top four, and which really happens if people lose trust in you, is that there is something going on and the feedback loop is not there, and it's going to be a while before you understand what's going on. So this is key. Of course, at this stage, you know that the impact of fraud is lost customers. Next slide, please. So you can target higher security for the sake of fraud, and many companies do that. But remember, there's that trade-off. We talked about that. The higher security usually implies higher friction. Consumers are looking for both. In fact, 92% said that they expect both. And if anyone indexes on one side or the other, you have to recognize you are not working in monopolies, right? Like, there are competitors out there who strive to do both. In fact, Ekata works with so many merchants and so many providers, in which we are just amazed at the amount of effort they put in to balance these two factors and do it really well for their customers. And that is really a recipe for gaining share in the market. Next slide, please. So let me tell you a little bit about this graphic. This is a hint that owing to a multitude of factors, the world is focusing a lot more on card fraud. So what you see here is there's about $30 billion of cost of card fraud. This is according to the Nielsen report from last year. But if we actually compute this based on industry and our computations of the revenue lost to declines, it's over 10x of that. That's a massive delta, right? This is how much you realize that the world is towards the side of getting to lower fraud and are actually negatively impacting consumer experience. How does this happen? Several of you might know this. We mentioned this in our previous, my colleague Spencer McLean mentioned it in a previous MPE webinar, that over 97% of in-person transactions are authorized, right? Like when you go in the store, your potential of being authorized is higher. The fact is that for issuing banks, the issuing banks only authorize about 83% of online transactions. That's a way smaller number. And the 14-15% delta between low 80s to high 90s is not all fraud. I mean, it makes instinctive sense, but if you actually look at the numbers, the percentage of false declines of the total decline transactions range anywhere between 20 to 70%. That's crazy high. I mean, they say that the median lies in the mid 30s, but any of those, either 20 or 70, those are very big numbers. And if you decline a consumer, we already talked about this. If you decline a customer, they are most likely going to churn, or they might not come to your platform, which is actually worse because you spent money trying to get them on the platform. The numbers are that about a third, that is 30-33% of them, are not likely to come back to you. You put it all together and you look at this figure, the cost of a lost customer is lost revenue, not just the current revenue, but the lifetime value of that customer, that everything the customer would have given you over their lifetime. As well as if you have worked hard, your marketing department or others have worked hard to acquire them, there's a customer acquisition cost. And finally, adding it all together, there's a loss of brand equity and trust, right? So this is the part about false declines and how that is actually the biggest negative point out of this triad. Now, coming to the next slide. Thank you. The harsh reality of PSD2 SCA. Now, we talked, I had introduced this framework of the 3 fraud, friction, false declines, particularly to get back to this. Our intent is to improve trust, but what's actually happening here is lower trust at a higher cost. This is the reality of PSD2 SCA. And why? Because PSD2 SCA puts in stricter fraud thresholds. And again, Spencer and others, you know that the threshold values are very low. We've talked about that before. In the case of SCA, the higher number of steps will also lead to higher friction and impact conversion rates. That is also expected. In practice, actually, 3DS2 takes over 35 seconds to complete. That is a lot of friction. So 3DS2, while it's tremendously improved over 3DS1, it still is a lot of friction because it takes a lot of time. So there's no question about it, because there's a portion of the transactions that are going to be mandated through 3DS2, it's going to be higher friction. The stricter fraud thresholds will also lead to higher rates of false declines, which is also a direct impact on lifetime revenue, which we just talked about. So putting these 3 together, there's lower trust. The cost will also go up. 3DS requires processing cost, The card schemes may change or may charge some authentication fees over here too. And all this effort that is required to rebalance fraud rates with other measures, that trade-off curve that we talked about, that rebalancing to new fraud rates and new measures requires a lot of organizational and development costs. So the net result of this is higher cost. Next slide, please. So what's happening here? This is the picture we saw earlier. Could you just advance this, please? What's actually happening is that from wherever you were in that balance state in the middle, your the happy Goldilocks middle situation you had chosen is going to go into this imbalance because of PSD2 SCA, because now you're going to higher fraud limits. What can you do about that? And this is where we come to our next piece of learnings from our interview campaigns and our recommendations. Next slide, please. So how can you fix this trust issue? We recommend three pillars over here. The first is hygiene, the second is sharing, the third is data. Let me talk about each one of them. But before that, let's talk about just the interview campaign that Stratconat did for us. Let's go to slide 12, please. Or the next slide, slide 15. So the learnings from acquirers and PSPs. These are just the setup to let you know what whom we interviewed and before we tell you what we learned. Several of the findings in the next few slides are actually based on this interview campaign. Three things to note here. The companies we interviewed represent over 60% of card not present volume in Europe. That is truly representative. If you look at the chart on the left, we had a good mix of small to large companies based on card not present transaction volume processed. And that was one of our intents. We did not want to over-index towards one side, one size level. The map on the right, if you look at it, we interviewed companies across Europe, not just restricted to one or two countries. Again, we wanted to represent a broader set of countries to get different perspectives. Next slide, please. So coming to the first pillar, which I mentioned was hygiene. When you're talking about hygiene, the first step is to understand outer scope transactions and enable low friction options. This is almost to the level of your fiduciary duty as a merchant or a PSP to minimize the amount that goes through high friction options. So the chart on the left is from MasterCard's data. In fact, I first saw this data in MPE earlier this year, with the estimates of the impact of PSD2 SCA on EU e-commerce by volume. You will see that about half the volume would need SCA step up. If you think about that, some of the things to do there are lower friction options, things like biometrics such as facial recognition, fingerprints, and other low friction methods. I've split out biometrics separately from SCA step up, though it's a part of the same thing. Things like, if you look at I want you to focus on the blue pieces of it, and on the blue side, there are specific things that you need to execute on as a merchant or as a PSP, help your merchants execute on them. So things like merchant initiated transactions, this includes subscription and recurring payments, or things like top-ups when you add money when it goes below a particular threshold. Things like installment payments, all of these are exempted. In things like recurring payments, the first one requires an SCA, but the later ones do not, and those are initiated by the merchants, hence the term MIT, or merchant initiated transactions. in those ones are exempted, and tagging them right is very, very important. Low value payments that are below 30 euros are also exempted. And until a customer, of course, reaches over 100 euros with an issuer. Now, these are some of the things that I'm telling you here are mentioned in the opinion as well as the documents. And my intent is not to tell you all that's available. My intent here is to tell you that there are specific things that you should be aware of and tag them correctly. And it will call for some more research to figure it out, but it's important to do that right away. It is important also to note that consumers can whitelist merchants, and this is managed at the issuer level. So there is a call to action on the issuer side over here, but you as a merchant or a PSP should know how to enable it, right? Like it's an important piece to leverage, because if a consumer whitelists you with a particular issuer, you will end up having a frictionless experience over there and not require SCA. It's going to take a while to get to these whitelists, but it's definitely something to keep on your radar. One thing to note here is that anytime a party requests for an exemption, they will be carrying the liability. So keep that in mind. Next slide, please. So what are the actions you got to do to minimize authentication or reduce friction? First of all, merchants should do all the things that we talked about just now and more. That is, you should explicitly study ways to reduce friction. Larger merchants are doing this already, and they are making a lot of effort over here. They're doing tests on this, studies on this. In case of small and medium merchants, the payment providers often need to help them out. So the PSPs and payment providers, please help your smaller and medium merchants. Our experience is that they are not ready. Note that also the small and medium merchants have mostly caught up on the awareness compared to last year. I remember having conversations around May, June of last year, and we were just worried that the merchants are not even aware of PSD2 SCA, the smaller and the medium-sized one. What we realized, and if you look at the quote on the bottom right over here, merchant awareness is almost 100% now, and we see that in the market. But the understanding, particularly for medium and small size merchant, is very low. It could be as low as 30%. And in this quote, the PSP mentioned the number 30%, but I don't find that very, very different from our understanding. No quantitative data here, but just based on conversations. So all that said, you have to keep this in mind, that if when PSD2 SCA hits, there are going to be medium and small merchants, or if you are a medium and small merchants, that are going to start suffering, and larger merchants might start taking share. Next slide, please. So that was the first pillar of hygiene, and the important thing to remember for hygiene is execution, execution, execution. You gotta just find out what are the basics and execute away. The second part is sharing, and this is a very important lever let's start with sharing of risky transactions. So for the riskier transactions, you need to send the issuer more data to give them confidence. This is almost obvious. The reason issuers do not authorize a large portion, like between 17 to 20% of online transactions, is because they do not have enough data. They have data on the purchases of a particular customer, but they do not have specific data that merchants has. For example, how are they spending time on the site? Things like even address details. Where did they make the transaction? Several of those details are not there right now. So to fill that gap, the standard for sending authentication data to issuers is 3D Secure, and everyone should be moving to the latest version. This is very, very critical. And 3DS2 offers several advantages. I think almost everyone in the audience might know this, that the advantages that are consistent user experience, there is native app support, there are things like to do biometric authentication, I believe you need 3DS2 Plus. So that's just to name a few, but there are various advantages. There's, in spite of everything, I call it the lesser of the two evils. It is still high friction, but it is inevitable that you'll have to use 3DS. So go to the latest version, it has advantages. As far as processors and PSPs are concerned, they need to get to 3DS too. But if you actually look at the statistic at the bottom based on our interview campaign, 9 out of 10 are already ready with 3DS and rapidly moving to the latest versions. So in the case of PSPs and processors, it's good to know, at least there might have been some bias in the folks we interviewed, but in general, we talked about being representative enough, and it's encouraging to see that most of them support it. In fact, most of the folks we interviewed support the basics pretty well. If we were interviewing merchants, the story would be completely different. It's not the case that the merchants are ready with the latest version of 3DS2, and you can see them suffering. Next slide, please. All right, so the other side about sharing is about knowing and optimizing for the ecosystem. The issuers have the final say for authorization. We know that, right? An issuer behavior varies a lot. The best way to figure out what works for you is gathering and experimentation. So you got to gather the data and do experimentation. And the bigger merchants do it themselves. The processors or PSPs should help the smaller merchants find these trends. So what do I mean by the trends? So you have to understand the issuers better. To understand the issuers better, there are different types of exemptions that are granted. They grant different kinds of exemptions. Their trends and authorization will vary over time as PSD2 SCA comes into force, but even already you'll start seeing some of those trends as they execute on it. The data they like to see for granting exemptions might also be different. So just some examples, but at the end of the day, understanding the major issuers that impact you is certainly a strategic lever. To improve authorizations, you could also think about, the larger merchants can think about using multiple processors to optimize their routing. And we are seeing several of them doing that already. And smaller merchants can gain from full liability shift. And if you actually see again at the bottom right, what we found out from our interview campaign is that a small portion have started offering full liability shift as a service already, and several are planning to offer more of it. And full liability shift will be taking the liability from the smaller merchant, the smaller merchant does not have enough data or enough of a capability to do the kind of analysis that will ask for exemptions and confidently ask for exemptions, which is why this as a service is a good one. Now, why do I think it is a good idea to focus on these small and medium merchants? And it's actually a differentiator in the market if processors and PSPs think about doing that, particularly in Europe. So if you look at the online retailers in North America, the top 20 end up having about 75% of the e-commerce market. That's massive, right? Even Amazon by themselves have about 50% of the market in North America. The situation in Europe is different. Amazon has got a smaller share, I think closer to 5%, but the top 20 merchants only have less than 20% of the market. That means if you look at the market in Europe, there is a fat tail of medium to small merchants who require help. And this is truly an untapped market from the PSD2 SCA perspective, and like focusing on this side of the market and serving them well. So that's a recommendation for processors and PSPs. Next slide, please. The last pillar is data, and in some ways this is the most important pillar. If you first look at the fraud thresholds that are very stringent, they are, just to give you an overview of the levels, it's 13 basis points between 30 to 100 euros, and it goes down to 6 basis points between 100 to 250, and 1 basis point between 250 to 500. These are very, very low values. Of course, some merchants, processors have it already, but in general, these are very low values. So merchants need to target the right fraud rate. If you have to get to the right fraud threshold, it doesn't mean the minimum fraud. Of course it doesn't, right? Like, it needs to be what is achievable while balancing out friction and false declines. It takes time to figure that out. Because it takes time to figure that out, you've got to start as soon as possible. I cannot emphasize that enough. You got to start doing that right away. So these rates are very hard to achieve, and they require advanced data and models. Both merchants and providers need to use authoritative data and ML models to get down to these rates. The good news is that in our interview campaign, we realized that the larger PSPs who process over 1 billion in transactions, over 75% of them already have started utilizing machine learning based fraud screening, which is great news for the merchants too, because they are planning to use these tools to help their merchants improve their rates. So going on to the next slide, please. So we talked about the riskier transactions, and early on we talked about exemptions. One of the biggest exemptions, and I reserved it for the end for the data side, is because it's one of the things that is hardest to do and requires a lot of effort, but still one of the most important levers. If you want to figure out lower risk transactions, EBA mandates building a TRA, or a transaction risk analysis model. The EBA also mandates that certain data, such as abnormal spending behavior or abnormal payer or payee location, and I think it's in section 8 of the RTS. You can look it up there. There are some very basic fundamentals, that the obvious things that everyone should be doing. They mandate they should use these for building transaction risk analysis model. But we believe that besides the mandated data, to get to the lowest possible rate, it makes sense to utilize third-party data that helps you build a better TRA. The important thing is not just to build a TRA to check the box. The important thing is to build a good TRA. The good TRA matters because, first of all, based on the decision from the transaction risk analysis, you are going to ask for an exemption, and you're agreeing to take liability on the basis of that. I mentioned earlier that if you're asking for an exemption, you are taking the liability. So you better be sure about that. And secondly, if you think about how the issuers, or at least the more disciplined or sophisticated issuers, will figure out if you are asking for exemptions, TRA exemptions, that actually end up leading to chargebacks or fraud later. So they'll start discounting the value of your TRA. So build a good TRA. So a few things to note here. Many large merchants use multiple providers, and it makes sense for them to build their own TRA. If you're using multiple processors or providers, it might make sense for you to build your own TRA. The processors get data from multiple merchants in no standardized format. So usually, if you are a merchant, you'll collect data from your portal, and it will be in one format, because generally you will keep it in some standardized fashion. But processors, because they're getting data from multiple merchants and multiple providers and multiple third parties, they do not get it in a standardized format or a normalized format, and it's very hard to build models and do real-time risk assessment for that. So that's one of the places that Ekata actually focuses a lot on and returning normalized data. The PSPs we interviewed see TRA, if you look at the quote at the bottom, as they see TRA as an opportunity to provide value and generate additional revenue. So they are actually seeing this as a method of improving their share and also gain some revenue. Next slide, please. All right, just to give you some more data that we saw from our interview campaign. And this chart shows you the percentage of processors receiving the data that is mentioned here. So for example, if you look at the top, beyond the payment instrument and amount that everyone receives, billing address, shipping address, about 80% of them have started getting addresses, but only 40% at the very bottom right now get user behavior. But all of these curves are going to the right because the processors have been updating their APIs and SDKs to receive additional data. So this is another secular shift in the market almost, that now not just the merchants but also the processors will start seeing a lot more of data such as identity data, user behavior data. And we've also seen that several, starting with IP and device ID, and then going on to identity data, multiple PSPs and merchants are supplementing their data using third parties. Next slide, please. So we are down to our last couple of slides. These are just the takeaways over here. So we talked about the 3 pillars: hygiene, sharing, and data. The first important takeaway here: hygiene is about execution. You have to manage the basics to minimize consumer friction. It's very important to do that. The second is sharing, and sharing is a lot about things like sharing data and implementing things like 3DS, but mostly it's about understanding the other party and being proactive about data usage and sharing between merchants and issuers, because that is the biggest gap of less data between the two sides, and that's what leads to the lack of trust. And then finally, data, which is about developing capabilities. Sourcing data, utilizing data, cleaning up data, and building good models are completely new capabilities. And these are capabilities for this new generation, right? Like if you are in this space, you have to develop these capabilities, and that's key. Next slide. Thank you. So we talked about this trade-off curve, and we were at this imbalance situation. Could you advance, please? Once more. What you see is actually, and you don't have to restrict yourself to that old trade-off curve. If you follow some of the advice that we have given here, if you make an effort towards it, your trade-off curve starts moving towards the top right here. That means you end up getting a new trade-off curve, and you could get to a lower friction and a lower fraud scenario. Yes, that's the end of my presentation. Can we go to the next slide? I wanted to make a point here that this is just a summary of some of what we found out in our interview campaigns. If anyone is interested in finding out more, we'd be happy to spend time with you. You can contact either me or my colleague who heads our European operations, Spencer McLean. And you'll have our emails available later when this material is available on MP. I think we have time for some questions.
We do indeed, Arjun, and from my side, thanks. That was a fantastic overview on the whole issue of PSD2 SCA. I specifically really like your 3 pillars of trust model. You might have to patent that, with the kind of fraud, friction, and false declines. Whichever way you look at it, yeah, absolutely. Whichever way you look at it, if it's $28 billion for fraud, versus $300 billion for false declines, these are big chunks of money. So I was just going to ask you, in the case of Ekata, how are you specifically helping merchants find that right balance?
So working with both merchants and PSPs, what we did, we've been helping over thousands, actually over 1,700 enterprise customers globally for years now. But particularly related to PSD2 SCA, we saw this as an opportunity when PSD2 SCA came up and we were nearing the deadline. So 2 years back, we dedicated our teams, our product engineering teams, into an effort to understand better and invest in PSD2 SCA. So some of the things that we did was, because you need to get this identity data in real time. So Ekata provides global digital identity data solutions for consumer verification, of course, using APIs. So we first focused on low latency because we knew that it's going to be in real time, and having this data available in real time is very hard. So now we have a P99, like 99% of transactions are below 80 milliseconds. So that is well within the time limits that you require for doing this kind of decisioning. And to do that, it required setting up an EU data center, reducing third-party calls, a lot of product and engineering requirements. And the second thing we did is we focused a lot on European and global data, and we've been doing that for years now, and delivering that in a consistent, normalized format, which I mentioned earlier is important. And finally, we also realized that there is importance of network, since we have this 1,000+ customer network, using the risk signals from based on anonymized API usage from these thousands of customers is a valuable signal back to our customer base, again, in this real-time decisioning. So these are some of the investments we did, and we are, several of our customers have started using us already, and they use us on top of the waterfall for TRA models.
Excellent. Well, that's good to know, and it sounds like a lot of hard work has gone into building those solutions. Just going on to some of the questions that we had, we have one from Heidi at Nordea Bank, basically asking what are the most common and cost-effective methods for 3D secure SCA authentication, and that's whilst you're balancing or trying to get a smooth customer experience. Is that something you can address, Arjun?
Sure. So just to first answer the question about the methods. So there are many, the most common methods. The first one, unfortunately, is SMS OTP. That is like a high friction method. Then there are others related to card readers and authentication apps. And then finally, biometrics. Now, there are, in all of these methods, you can see biometrics being the least friction method. And overall, I strongly recommend for those who afford it to actually experiment with several methods and not follow any generic advice and see what works. But if I were to give some generic advice, there was this Visa report I remember reading in which it said that biometric authentication reduces the drop-off rates by 70%. As soon as, and that is compared to things like OTP via SMS. Now, if you look at that metric, what are you thinking? Like, imagine how much additional revenue, how much additional customer satisfaction you get out of that, or improvement in customer experience. Does cost really matter? I question that. Of course, keep costs in mind, but these are things that will impact your revenue way more than the cost.
Well, certainly given the cost of false declines, or I think Spence on the last session referred to it as customer insults.
Yes,
where 32%
that's a good way to put it.
Absolutely. Now, no surprises. We had several questions coming in about the delay on SCA implementation as a result of coronavirus or COVID-19. And I think that whole deadline issue is slightly polemical right now, but it sounded like from what you said, that is being debated. Can you give us some, and maybe this is just your personal opinion, so we're not going to hold you to this.
Yeah, I have some strong opinions on it, and
okay.
In fact, I know you and I talked about it earlier, so you know my personal opinion. And in fact, on March 25th, the EBA met and they said that the December end date will remain unchanged, but they will continue to monitor events and decide on measures. So this is what they had said. But based on what we hear in the industry by some very authoritative sources, but again, it's a lot of speculation there too. The end of year date, I am almost certain needs to get postponed. It's going to get postponed. I don't necessarily like it, but or I actually am somewhat agnostic on whether I like it or not. Not made up my mind. It might make sense to delay it perhaps to the UK date of 14th March. Just a thought. The important thing why it will cause for why it should be delayed is because there is so much that goes into doing this right, and it is very hard to do it at this time. It is, these companies are truly suffering today if you've not implemented it, and there were people who will be fine-tuning models at this time and fine-tuning their fraud levels. These are extraordinary times. Nobody knows what level of fraud you're going to have, because you mentioned earlier, Alan, that there's an increase in the amount of e-commerce, but fraud models are based on historical patterns, and you don't have any historical pattern to go by out here. So it's a very hard time to be fine-tuning models at this stage. Yeah. So I would say the EBA will get it and they will delay it.
Okay, but from what you're saying, the percentage of PSPs who are already compliant is quite high. So that was interesting to see. I also had a couple of other of these questions, one from Payment Sense, and this was based on POS contactless SCA impact. This is obviously a topic dear to my heart. Yes. But what's your view on this whole, in-store or point of sale contactless SCA issue, Arjun?
So the first thing here is, of course, it's governments, and I think WHO also mentioned that they recommend not using cash, and because of that, the contactless payment with a card or with a mobile phone is currently encouraged by government bodies, as well as everyone is working on that, because there is no physical interaction with the terminal. Of course, there are times when you need for two-factor the pin on the terminal's pin pad, but there are many contactless, as you know better than most of us, that there are truly contactless methods. So that's much safer. So the lower limits for contactless have been increased from 25 to 50 euros, which you had mentioned early on. And let me explain what that means. The exemption are based on the low value of contactless transactions up to 50 euros. So that means for up to 50 euros, you can use contactless and go up to a maximum of 150 euros of cumulative spend over 5 consecutive transactions. And the 150 euro cumulative spend and 5 consecutive transactions are both specific criteria that the issuer is allowed to choose between. So many countries have an increase. You mentioned the 45 pound in yes, in UK, and there's 50 euros in most of the countries in Europe now, up from 25 euros. And I think it's a very good change. In fact, mandating these, just keeping an open mind for this is truly where technology is helping out in this crisis.
Good stuff. Good stuff. Well, we would love to continue a lot further. We have a lot of unanswered questions. I've got another one here about does 3DS2 actually fulfill SCA requirements? But I don't think we really want to go there today. So that's maybe a topic for another discussion.
I would like. I think I'll have information about who sent questions. We'll respond to each one of the questions separately.
That would be fantastic, Arjun. So I'd like to thank you for a very insightful webinar. I'd like to thank everyone who joined us. It's been a fantastic turnout today, and we're really grateful for it. Huge thanks to Ekata for sponsoring the webinar, as well as, of course, to MPE, Philip, and the rest of the team at Imperia for organizing today. So thank you all. Thanks, Arjun, and stay safe, everyone. Thank you.
Thanks, Alan. Thanks for the great moderation.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.